Hello and welcome to the Climate Resilience Podcast, brought to you by JBA Consulting. I'm Phil Emonson, and in this podcast series, we unpick some of the complexities, challenges and opportunities on the topic of climate resilience with some inspirational thought leaders. And today's episode is a big milestone as we celebrate our first year of the podcast. Over the last year, we've had some great conversations, and for this anniversary episode, we wanted to pick up on some of those topics that we've started to explore, but perhaps need a little extra time for. And I'm delighted to say that we're bringing back three amazing guests from previous episodes. In episode 7, we had a super conversation on the role of social value in building resilient communities with Kat Cornfield from the Environment Agency and Lucy Formoy from JBA. And then in episode 9, Karl Astbury from the Resilient Cities Network joined the conversation on what we mean by whole society. And it's great to welcome Kat, Lucy and Karl back to pick up on some of the topics and to extend the discussion. So welcome all back to the podcast. And maybe we could all just reintroduce ourselves. So Lucy, could I come to you first?
Yeah, hi Phil, thanks for having me back. I'm Lucy Formoy. I am a Principal Sustainability Analyst at JBA. My background is as a Chartered Architect, specialising in sustainable design and placemaking. I've been with JBA for around 2.5 years and I lead on social value and engagement at JBA.
Lovely, thanks. Nice to have you back. Kat, over to you.
Hi Phil, and yeah, thanks for having me back. So great pleasure. I'm Kat Cornfield, Social Equity Senior Advisor at the Environment Agency. I've worked at the EA for coming up to 22 years now, and I've been had my finger in various pies, doing lots of different elements of environmental sustainability and regulation and all sorts of things. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you. And last but definitely not least, Karl, over to you.
Yeah, really glad to be back, Phil, and congratulations on reaching the 1 year milestone. What an achievement. So I'm Karl Astbury. I work with the Resilient Cities Network, and my focus is on the intersection between climate and health, and really looking at how cities can tackle climate risks in ways that improve everyday life and reduce inequality. A lot of my work is based in Greater Manchester through a programme that we're running called Resilience for Communities, which is funded by the Ed Zurich Foundation. But I also get to collaborate with cities all over the world to share ideas and test out what actually works on the ground.
Fantastic. And I think in the next half hour, 40 minutes or so, we're going to explore some of those points anyway. So, look, Karl, I'd like to start with you actually, because in episode 9, we were having a chat about why local stories matter and the importance of storytelling and how we value that lived experience. And we place a lot of value on the role that climate data and science provide, but you used a phrase in that episode that stuck with me and that I've used actually since, and it's one of flattening the hierarchy. So in other words, giving equal profile, equal voice, equal prominence to everyone across society. And so to move that thought on then, one of the risks when we engage whole society every time is that of engagement fatigue. Lots of agencies, bodies, public bodies, private sector, all seeking to consult with the same community on slightly different topics, but fundamentally a lot of similarities, I'm sure. So, Karl, from your work in Manchester and other cities as well, what's the risk when all these different engagement strategies aren't aligned?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest risks really when engagement isn't aligned is that communities end up feeling over-consulted, but fundamentally underheard. People are giving their time, their energy, sometimes repeatedly, but if they don't see change, or if the messages they receive from different agencies are contradictory, trust really begins to erode. And over time, that can reduce people's willingness to participate at all, which is a real danger, because it's often those who are already under pressure, whether that's financially or socially or related to their health. It's those people who there's a real danger of those people getting disengaged first. So from my perspective, alignment isn't just about efficiency or avoiding duplication. It's about building coherence. So when you bring different agencies together, whether that's local government, whether that's housing providers, health services, community groups, and you bring those people together around a shared conversation, residents will hopefully then be able to see outcomes that they can connect to. And fundamentally, that's building the confidence, the ownership, and ultimately makes the whole system more resilient. So one takeaway from the work that we've been doing and we've been thinking about is the need for, community resilience assessments, local needs assessments, avoiding the community being asked their opinion on 20 different things over the course of 1 year. And there's some questions I got. How do we better combine resources across different sectors to really understand what the community needs, rather than the usual tick box exercise to say satisfy planning approvals? How can we use information that's been collected previously by another engagement exercise? So I think there's some work to be done when we start to think about trying to assess the needs at a community level.
It's a great place to start. Thanks, Karl. And you're right. I wrote down there whilst you were talking this erosion of trust. And I think that's something we might come back to actually later on in the conversation. But Lucy, I'd like to bring you in here, and Kat as well, actually, because your work around social value, a lot of that centres around local needs assessments, which Karl has just alluded to. So I'd like to get your take on this and that point around how we can better combine resources and learn from what's gone before, so we're not reinventing wheels each time. Lucy, do you perhaps want to pick up that thread to start with?
Yeah, absolutely. All really interesting stuff that Karl was talking about. And just to say, we've definitely experienced that on projects before, where members of the community can just become really frustrated as they feel they're being asked the same questions over and over, but action isn't happening. And this can be a real barrier to engagement. So absolutely agree with your points there, Karl. So we really need to be taking into account the community's needs within our engagement approach and our social value initiatives. And ensure they feel fully listened to and understood. And this reminds me of something I've read in a book recently. The book is called The Body Holds the Score, and it explores the science behind how we respond to and recover from trauma and disasters. And it mentions that social support is the most powerful protection from overwhelm and stress during a disaster, and that reciprocity is critical. So being truly heard and seen by those around us. This is why, particularly in the context of climate change related events, which may result in loss, disruption and trauma, it's essential we use engagement as a real tool, not just as a tick box, and that it's tailored to the needs of those groups and individuals within the community, making sure that we're tapping into local needs assessment as a tool. And ensuring communities and individuals feel heard, understood, listened to, and truly connected with.
Yeah. Go on, Kat, please.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. Local needs assessments and analysis, some of that, a lot of it is informed by the engagement side of things, as well as all the sort of desk-based studies that we do. In the area, and really understanding the demographic and what those needs might look like. And, we could be doing several projects. There could be lots and lots of different organisations doing all sorts of different projects, coming from a single angle, all sort of bombarding that community at the same time. And when they're not doing that, they're potentially repeating all of that research as well. So in terms of consistency, in terms of being efficient, what would be really good is sort of having a joined up approach, which was what Karl was saying in the opening sort of bit of the talk. What we should be doing is sort of sharing local needs analysis work that we're doing in a location to avoid all that duplication, increase the efficiency, because why should we, why do something that that's been done elsewhere? And we do have an example actually of this. So a really good example was from the Isle of Wight Joint Strategic Needs Assessment. So this assessment is an ongoing process, and it involves loads of different partner organisations, the voluntary sector and the wider community. All of those people's work affects people's health and well-being. So by joining up and having this joint needs assessment, it gives a picture of current and future health and well-being needs of the Isle of Wight residents. It also helps to inform decisions about how we're all designing and commissioning and delivering our services. And it provides a really, really important evidence base for their joint health and well-being strategy. And it's all done once, it evolves, and it's an ongoing process. So it means that social value initiatives can be designed using the same evidence, and we're all working together on that. And I've got one other example actually, and it's more from a sort of very local organisation level, and it's on the lines of this consistency with local needs assessment. So at the Environment Agency, we've developed a social value toolkit, which provides a framework for all projects that we do to consistently plan local needs-based social value activities and initiatives based on the local need and government missions. So there's an opportunity for us to share the outputs of the toolkit and to with other projects across the Environment Agency, so that we're not duplicating every time we're looking at local needs in the same area. So working together, there's so much going on in our communities, it just makes sense to join forces.
Yeah, really good to have that toolkit to hand, and also really interesting there to hear about the example you gave from the Isle of Wight. It's fantastic to see. And actually I might turn at this point then to Karl, because obviously through your work with the Resilient Cities Network, and you referenced in the introduction, although you predominantly work in Manchester, there's a lot of other cities that you're individually involved with, but also across the organisation. And this idea then of these sort of multi-organisational local needs assessments, or these assessments that are sort of done at different scales to leverage greater outcomes, really to avoid that need to reinvent the wheel. Are there any examples you've come across, Karl, on a more sort of international scale?
Yeah, there's a couple of examples that come to mind. It's really interesting hearing about the example that Kat shared from the Isle of Wight, and in a way, these examples there's lots of similarities. So one example which I refer to a lot and has been an ongoing inspiration for me is in Rotterdam, and there's a community there called Botu, and as part of the work to try and improve the resilience and living standards of this community, who when compared to the kind of lots of average metrics for the rest of the city, they're very much left behind. They've done a piece of work where they're framing resilience as the social and the physical together, and it's not an either or. And they've developed a really interesting kind of structure for the program, and it's a long-term endeavour. It's over 10 years. And the structure links what gets done, how it gets done, and where effort should be concentrated, with safety treated as a precondition rather than an add-on. And what it's doing is it's bringing together the local government, market actors, institutions, resident networks, and ensuring everyone's aligned from the outset. And then you've got this kind of living coalition where there's very public goals that people can see, responsibilities are distributed, and then progress is measured against the social index, so people can see progress and movement in real life. And then another example is a community in Lagos where partners co-produced a community resilience action plan that starts with everyday reality. So things like flooding, insecure roads, precarious access to water and health. And it's turning it into a prioritised agenda that residents can own. And they've worked to map community assets, they've named governance gaps, they've tied each priority, whether that's water, education, roads and drainage, safety and security and health, to really practical initiatives, and naming the agencies that are responsible for delivery. So I think it's bringing those two examples are really about bringing the community and lots of different actors together to really understand what that community needs, develop, co-produce those priorities, and then begin to implement work on the ground. We've been doing something very similar. We've applied some of that discipline in Greater Manchester through the Resilience for Communities programme. And we began with community-led resilience assessments. And I think resilience is quite a useful unifying term at a place-based level. So we've been conducting these community-led resilience assessments, and then we're building coalitions around the results of those assessments. So again, residents, local government, housing providers, health partners, utilities, local SMEs, and then developing really tangible projects to move the dial, hopefully.
That's really interesting. I was, as you were talking there about the development of these partnerships and these coalitions, I was actually thinking, well, in order for them to be successful, we need to, as we were talking in the introductions, we need to flatten the hierarchy. We need to make sure that those community voices are actually heard and valued amongst the partners around the table, the professional partners who are bringing their own different perspectives. So that's really interesting how we've gone full circle in that first topic there. I'd like to sort of move the conversation on a little bit to how our communities and the work we do in them experiences different pressures. So our places, the places we want to make resilient, be that at a local or regional, or in the case of Manchester and Lagos city level, even national level, they're exposed to different funding and finance arrangements over time, different political agendas, different political cycles as well. I don't want to make this a political discussion, but I suppose the question is, how do we navigate those changing landscapes, be that funding and finance or politics, that's sort of being superimposed maybe from a national level down to that regional or local or city level. Kat, maybe let's start with you on this one.
Yeah, so it's a tricky one, actually. How do we navigate it? I think firstly, it's important to remember that regardless of politics, in the short term, community needs don't change, do they? We have to be patient with social value, which can take years to take hold and benefit a society. But in the short term, we can do a lot, though we need to be mindful of keeping the community's long-term goals in mind all the time. In the public sector, we're backed by some really robust national policies. So we've got the 2023 Procurement Act, the National Procurement Policy Statement, and we've also got the Social Value Act. And they all place a great deal of emphasis on and responsibility really on delivering social value through public procurement. It's a great driver from a national standpoint, and appetite in general, and in my experience, I think, has been really good to do this stuff and really implement what the legal side of things is saying. But the balance lies where there are different local drivers. So some might prioritise and actively embed social value by prioritising sustainability or local jobs and inclusion, but others may place a lot less emphasis on these things, and they might be aiming for quick wins instead. So this means that while national policy sets the framework, local politics determines the ambition and the depth of delivery. Yeah. And of course, if we're linking back to engagement and local needs, there are grassroots community drivers too, and the residents themselves can influence leaders to go beyond that minimum compliance that they're expected to do and embed meaningful social value into procurement. And so I think really, after saying all that, I think the answer that I would say is that we need to be really thinking collectively about how we create a permanent culture of social value and community sustainability, and that culture is sort of resilient to all these smaller pressures and these forever changing pressures. And like you say, whether that's funding or politics, or, it could even be that, that the government have got other priorities with big storms or all sorts of things. So it's about how do we make that a permanent culture of social value.
I like that. Yeah, that's really interesting. Lucy, I'll seamlessly bring you in here because I'm sure you've got some interesting thoughts to add.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree with everything that Kat's saying. And I think really the key here is adopting that bottom-up approach, and why local needs assessment is such a powerful tool. So as Kat's saying, local needs are more constant, and they do change over time, but it's usually on a much longer term basis. And they're usually unlikely to be hugely affected in the short term by kind of political shifts. So by responding to local needs, we can be sure to create that true impact and have lasting changes, which is what we want to do with our social value initiatives. And we also need to make sure we can work with the local charities and community groups and social enterprises whose priorities are usually based around community needs in any case. And we can tap into different resources which don't as heavily rely on these political shifts. And just going back to Kat's point to reiterate that we know that social value is about that long-term benefit and leaving legacy, and we're not interested in those superficial short-term benefits. So, unlike shorter-term political cycles and the shifts that might happen on a short-term basis.
Yeah, fantastic. Karl, let's finish with you just on this topic then of how we maintain continuity of the acceleration of our work at a local level amidst all this sort of broader political or investment, funding and finance change, etc. I mean, Lucy and Kat there have both promoted and endorsed the need of this culture of social value that's resilient to those changes, and also endorse the local needs assessment as that really important local tool. But again, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's really, really interesting to hear from Lucy and Kat just then. And I would just add that this is a challenge everywhere across the world. And we all know that climate resilience is by definition a long-term agenda. But politics in most places often works in extremely short cycles. And there's a danger that mismatch can effectively stall momentum. So one of the ways through it, I think, is to embed resilience into institutions and coalitions rather than relying on individuals. So when strategies are tied into statutory plans or climate acts or cross-party commitments, they are much, much harder to unravel with a change in leadership. But also, just as importantly, building broad coalitions. So, all the stuff that we've been talking about, bringing in the private sector, civil society, and communities themselves. That'll mean the agenda isn't held by one political office alone. It becomes much harder to ignore. And I think storytelling is a really key bit of this. If we frame resilience in terms of the everyday benefits people care about, things like healthier homes, lower energy bills, safer streets, it can much more easily resonate across party lines, and it's got a better chance of survival when there are those inevitable political swings. And we can see internationally, I talked about Rotterdam earlier, and they're rooting their adaptation work in strong community ownership and have got a clear long-term identity And that means that project has got a much better chance at riding out shifts in the political weather.
Yeah. And as you were talking there, Karl, I was reminded of the previous, or sorry, an episode from last month when we were talking with Manon Donahue from the States on Hurricane Katrina, and we closed that episode by looking at sort of politics in America at the moment, and what the sort of Trump administration are doing in terms of some of the climate data and the science that's previously been available, but actually how, irrespective of that, certainly in New Orleans and other cities that he's involved with, there are there are still projects and programs that are building resilience, and as you say, we normalize this with things that people can relate to, and so I'm going to try now to move us into our final topic, which I think will hopefully bring together some of these different strands that we've been talking about. And I'd like to put a spotlight on a particular case study. Lucy, JBA are working on a CoastWise project. Could you just explain and outline what that project entails? Because it's a really interesting one, and I think, as I say, we'll sort of pick up on a number of these topics we've been talking about.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Phil. So we are currently working in conjunction with North Norfolk District Council under the CoastWise project with the community of Overstrand in North Norfolk. And we're co-designing a community coastal transition plan, which will look at options for housing, infrastructure, community facilities, businesses, tourism, and other community priorities that may be impacted by coastal erosion. And for this, we're working really closely with the local community, and have already attended a couple of existing community events to start making these connections and inroads. So we're looking at linking in with those existing opportunities where possible. So things like going along to a community summer fair, and we even went along to the regular car boot sale to try and engage with the local community. But we do have lots of community workshops planned, as this process does really need to be truly co-designed to create real ownership within this community. We need to provide people with honest and non-jargoned information about the situation with coastal erosion for their community, where people can understand that risk as well as the opportunities that are available for them within this project. We're there to facilitate that process of enabling decisions to be made on how best this community can transition. And this can't be something that is done to that community. It really does need to be done by the community. This, of course, comes with its challenges, and not everyone in that community is going to be on the same page. But we're tailoring our engagement to try and meet the needs of different groups within the community, and acknowledging that there really isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. Above all, we're taking a transparent and understanding approach. And this engagement isn't a tick box process, but one where we want people to feel really truly heard and understood. And going back to a lot of those points we were talking about earlier at the start of the episode, really.
Mm-hmm. And as you've been sort of discussing there, I've been reminded of this term that I think Karl used first, but a number of us have used it in this episode, which is storytelling. And and this community has been experiencing coastal transition now for many years. This is nothing new, and the experiences, the stories, are part of what makes that community. And there's an interesting concept here that I'd like to introduce, which is one of kintsugi, which is where it's a Japanese art form where broken pottery or artifacts are repaired with gold lacquer, and that gold lacquer highlights the cracks, the stresses, the periods of adversity that item has experienced in its past, and it teaches us that actually in life, we can turn adversity into something that is beautiful and that is resilient. And I think that's a lovely analogy for CoastWise and this particular community in Norfolk, because it is part of its story and its history and what makes its social character. So let's highlight it, let's talk about it, let's tell that story. Lucy, linked to that, before I bring in Karl and Kat for their thoughts on on this example is this concept of adaptive release. Can you just explain what adaptive release is as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it really resonates with the concept you're just talking about. Adaptive release is a strategy used for heritage assets at risk of being lost due to coastal erosion. So Historic England describes this strategy as a positive, proactive option that supports the transformation of a heritage asset, including its values and significance within the landscape context. This basically means that we may accept that physical structures or landscapes may be lost, but we can find ways of capturing the values and significance of those assets and transforming them or reinterpreting them in a slightly different way. I think this concept can be used beyond just heritage assets, thinking about our coastal communities that may be facing loss due to coastal erosion. How can we capture that value and that significance of the essence of the community, the sense of place, etc., and help them transition this? Accepting that loss may occur and grief that comes with this, but applying a proactive option to move forward and transform into something new, while still capturing that essence of what was there before.
Yeah. That's great. Kat, can I bring you in here for your thoughts on CoastWise or anything around what Lucy's just been describing?
Yeah, I think it's such a good example of really bringing the community in and talking to them about it. And some of them are going to be really unsure about what they might need next. And that's a key point, really. You know, we need to be drawing on all of our experiences on other projects with other communities, and bringing forward some of those ideas to people to sort of present them and get them thinking about what it is that they think that they really need to keep the identity of their community, particularly if there's a risk of sort of losing particular elements of the identity of that community. So I think what this highlights is that need to, bring together our collective knowledge from all of the different organisations and initiatives that have been happening, not just in that particular locality, but beyond that, so that we can, collectively use it to make things better and to sort of make that piece of pottery, shine where the cracks have appeared and where we've put the gold lacquer in, and really sort of highlight it as something new and something that's potentially positive whilst not taking away from the history.
Yeah.
So I think that's where I'd go with that one.
Thank you. Yeah, and Karl, I'll give the last words to you on this. Your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And yeah, the CoastWise project, it's a new one to me, and it sounds like an amazing project. And I think one of the things that's really struck me about hearing about this CoastWise project is that it shows that resilience is about working with change, not against it. It's about kind of adapting with care. And yeah, the concept you brought in around kintsugi, that repair can create new forms of strength and beauty, and I think the CoastWise project kind of reflects that. And yeah, we know that coastal communities face multiple challenges at once. There's climate pressures, there's economic transitions, there's questions of identity and belonging and history, and I think this project demonstrates the value of tackling those issues in a integrated place-based way. So working directly with the communities that will be impacted, accepting that some change is inevitable, but also trying to help shape that change in ways that secure benefits for future generations. So for me, it's a great example to end on. It underlines all the earlier themes we discussed, really, doesn't it? Alignment across sectors, long-term commitment beyond political cycles, but most importantly, about grounding resilience in the lived experience of those most affected. The CoastWise project, it sounds a very durable project, and it's certainly a very inspiring one.
Thanks, Karl. And each time you come on the podcast, you leave me with this takeaway phrase. Last time it was flattening the hierarchy, and this time it's that, good resilience is about adapting with care and being sensitive to the history and the people and the place. And I really like that phrase. I think it's a lovely place to end on, adapting with care. Look, Kat, Lucy, Karl, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast and having a deeper dive and a really great conversation. So thanks very much. We've reached the end of our time today. As always, if you've enjoyed listening, then please hit the subscribe button so you're ready for our next episode in a few weeks' time. Till then, thanks for joining us. I'm Phil Emonson, and you've been listening to the Climate Resilience Podcast, brought to you by JBA Consulting.